Okay, I'm Carol. I'm RG's wife, and I am recovering from a knee surgery. I would like to say it was from parachuting out of an airplane, but it was just from snow skiing, and here I am now, caged up. But I want to tell you the first time I saw RG, and he was on the Ed Sullivan show. Has anybody ever seen Ed Sullivan? Anybody? I guess you're all too young. Well, Ed Sullivan was the first time Elvis Presley was on his show, the first time the Beatles were on his show, and the first time RG was on his show. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. And I saw that show. Wow. It was 1966, and at the beginning of it, everybody watched Ed Sullivan in 1966 that was alive. And at the very beginning of the show, Ed Sullivan said, I'm going to show you a clip of a Vietnam pilot that crash landed. Well, here's what happened. RG was coming in with his A1 airplane, and he couldn't get his landing gear down. Now that is really serious, because if you can't get your landing gear down, and you had one that will come down, if you landed with just one, your airplane would flip, on landing. So he called the tower and he said, I can't get my landing gear down. And so the tower said, go and drop your bombs in the ocean and we will foam the runway. Well, it just so happened that some photographers were there taking pictures of the F-5 doing touches and go, touch and go. And they heard that, well, they were there because they were doing the touch and goes for an F-5. Did I say that? Okay. But they heard that there was going to be a crash landing, and these photographers decided that will be much more interesting than doing these touch and go. So they ran over and set their cameras on the flight line and waited, and pretty soon here comes RG's and his A1 coming in, and that's what shows on the clip. And so they're waiting for him to come in, and you see on the clip they're coming in. Now, my adorable husband, of course, could fly and do everything right. And you see him coming in and flying in, and you see him hit the runway. But not only does he have to fly and hit it on his belly, but the propellers were also down there, and the propellers were hitting, and you could see all the sparks go crazy. But he belly flopped into the bomb, into the foam, and so he belly flopped into the foam, and then it puts it out, and he jumps out of the cockpit and ran right into the photographers. So you see this adorable little captain running right into the photographers. Well, I saw this, and I remember that because I didn't meet him for 20 years and never knew about this until someone at a party said, oh, RG, do you remember I saw you on Ed Sullivan? I said, what? I didn't remember. But you might have saw him too, if you remember. He was on the Ed Sullivan Show, and Nancy Sinatra was on that night singing Her Boots Are Made for Walking. So you might have seen it or heard about it. So anyway, I now want to present you with my adorable husband, Brigadier General R.G. Head.
Thank you, Carol. She's my best part.
I think she has a crush on you.
Pardon?
I think she has a crush on you.
No. Is this okay? No, not working now.
What happened?
Oh, I see.
Yeah. It's the Russians.
Okay. There we go. There, is that better? Okay, good. Well, now we can use a little bigger crowd. Okay. So during COVID, I wrote this book, and I got 51 stories from naval and Air Force pilots. And one guy led to another. Some were here and gave me advice, and another one of my buddies up at Point Magoo, and he put me onto some of the guys in the Hook system and guys that write the Navy proceedings. And so we got one after another, and ended up being 51 stories. So they'd send a little paragraph of something they did in Vietnam or linebacker or in flying the A4, and I put it into a broader context. So this is really a 100-year history of naval and Air Force aviation, and there's some contrast in there also between the two. After I wrote the book, I thought to illustrate some of these, and so this one's one I just got yesterday. Comparison between Air Force fighter and attack airplanes, and this is quite a controversy in the Air Force. Attack airplanes were not well thought of in the Air Force. In fact, in 1940, Hap Arnold said, we're going to discontinue attack airplanes because they're no good firing a machine gun, and they're only good dropping bombs. And so if they're good dropping bombs, why not build bombers that are built to drop bombs? And so we had a procurement, and down here we procured the A-20 Havoc from Douglas, the B-25 from North American, and the B-26 from Martin, and that's what we fought World War II with. There were a couple of odds and ends, that's the last time we had attack airplanes. In fact, one of the generals that I interviewed for the A-7 program said, why in the world did we want the A-7? We hadn't bought an attack airplane since 1940. And so, that's part of the controversy. Well, let's talk about the difference between Air Force and Navy. Well, first of all, out of these 51 stories, I've selected two that kind of characterize what I've written about. How the Navy developed the dive bomb tactic in the 1920s, and then how it paid off in the Battle of Midway. And secondly, how a small group of pilots called the Fighter Mafia designed the F-16 in secret in a Pentagon motel on weekends and nights, and got it adopted to be the most populous fighter in the Air Force today. So, okay, next slide. Okay, why are Air Force and Navy pilots different? First of all, they're different culturally. As soon as they get out of college or the academies, they go into a profession and they learn the ins and outs of that profession, and the two professions are very different. First of all, Air Force fighter squadrons have 24 airplanes. My first one was flying F-100s at Homestead Air Force Base, Florida. We have 3 squadrons in a wing, so a wing has 72 airplanes, all the same kind, and in 1962, Strategic Air Command was trying to take over the Air Force. General LeMay was the Chief of Staff, and so Strategic Air Command had consolidated maintenance, so by golly, all the fighter squadrons are going to have consolidated maintenance. So all of our maintenance people were taken over into a consolidated maintenance squadron. And we were hurting for personnel so bad, in that same year, we had 57 plane captains for 72 airplanes. And you can imagine none of those guys had any attachment to any particular airplane. And when I get down here, I'll find there are no names on Air Force airplanes either. In fact, they took all the squadron distinguishing marks off, which had been famous through the 1950s, especially those squadrons in Europe had very famous tail fin, mostly. They took all that away into the consolidated part. Now, Navy squadrons, I don't need to tell you, how many naval aviators we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, quite a few. Navy squadrons have a smaller number of airplanes, 12 or so, 14 maybe pilots, and they have their own maintenance. So those junior officers in Navy squadrons learn to supervise sailors in their very first job. They have a department head or branch, so you learn the things that the squadron needs to do, and I think your sailors get much better supervision than ours did. Because our maintenance squadrons only had 2 or 3 officers, and the rest were chiefs and enlisted people. Okay, every fighter pilot in the Air Force is a fighter pilot, not an attack pilot. I don't even think the A-10 pilots call themselves attack pilots. I think they call themselves fighter pilots because there is no tradition of fighter in the Air Force. Funny story, Kevin Miller told me a story about name tags, names on airplanes. He reported it into his A-7 squadron in Jacksonville. And it was on a Friday morning. They were having a ceremony, so all the people were away. So he goes into the maintenance hangar, and he sees a sailor up there painting his name beside the cockpit. That just exemplifies one of the differences between naval and Air Force people. Now, there are a few things in the Air Force that are especially distinctive. You see here, we'll see if this has a point. Look at that. Deployment refueling. I don't think the Navy deploys long distances. You can correct me on that. But I think you get to the war or you get to wherever you're going on board the carrier. The Air Force is different. My first deployment was from Florida to Turkey. 5,000 miles, 12 hours of flight time with 6 refuelings under a KC-135. And that's because we took the whole squadron over there to get the airplanes in place. Now, after we're overseas, then we send pilots one at a time. And that I think also is different from the Navy, because your squadron deploys and comes back together, and then you train another squadron group and you go over on another deployment. And so the culture is quite different. And I would even say that for the ladies here, I think the family life is different, because when a squadron of naval aviators deploys from a base, the families are living around that base. And since the facade was just going to be temporary duty, you didn't have to move off base if you were on base. And so, and that was when the deployment for 6 months, which was the limit of temporary duty. I don't know what you do about 9 months, and you know, as one of the wives said, we're in the 11th month of a 6-month deployment. You still have that kind of uncertainty in the Air Force, but I think it's unique to the Navy. So if a squadron deploys, in the old days, just guys, and the wives are left, they still have a community. And being a smaller group of 12 or 15, with a couple of girlfriends thrown in, I think that remains a small community. In the Air Force, when I went to Vietnam, if I had been married, my wife would have been in Iowa and wouldn't have had any attachment to any military unit or any kind of support, wouldn't have been close to a base to get any kind of commissary or other service. So that's a difference too, plus the long-range deployment. Now, the biggest difference, well, in a structural sense, is constant day-to-day readiness. Every squadron I was in had to maintain day-to-day readiness. We had to have 21 airplanes combat ready at all times and 21 pilots. That meant you can't let everybody go on leave at one time. You can't let the airplanes fall down. Now, I will say that in the current condition of parts being hard to get, all the military services are at very low states of readiness. And the F-18s are themselves have suffered a tremendous rate, down to as low as 40%. But that's all you can do. Money pays for spare parts, and that's what keeps airplanes flying. Secondly, you all know about the inter-deployment training cycle, and so I may tell some of the families. Naval aviators deploy theoretically once a year, or once every 18 months, and when they come back from deployment, they virtually disband. They're given all the hangar queens for airplanes. They don't fly very much. They go on leave, they go to school, they transfer out, people transfer in. You're putting together the nucleus of a squadron, and you have to build that up. So it's kind of like basic training. And then when you get to intermediate training, you fly a little more, you go out, you qualify on the carrier landings again. And then when you get close to deployment, that last 3 months, training gets very intense. You fly a lot, you go out to the carrier, you end it with a joint task force exercise with all the ships and destroyers and everything. So you put it all together, and then you're at a very high state of readiness, and you deploy, and the flyers fly en route to whatever location you're going to. If you're going to the Far East, you're going to fly quite a bit, you know, if you can, if the weather is good. I don't know where Jacqueline is. She's yeah. If we see if we get well. Okay, enough for cultural difference. Any questions on that or anything everybody wants to add? You know a lot more about it than I do. Yes, sir.
So where are the parts not coming from?
China.
Please don't say China.
First of all, when you deploy a new airplane, there is no logistic system set up with a normal usage rate. So every time you develop a new airplane, so like the F-35, there's no history of breaking spare parts. And you break, I bet I've broken an airplane or a down in the Navy at least once every other flight, sometimes 3 flights out of 4. So you always have something that goes wrong. It's not dangerous. We put it on a red diagonal. You can fly with it, and it's not serious. But if it's serious, it's a red cross, and you can't fly that airplane. But there are lots of little things that go on. Radios don't work all the time. Electronic gremlins come in. Things don't point in the right direction. Maybe a fuel tank doesn't feed correctly, but the others feed. There are just so many different things go on. So it's a real nightmare. And you can imagine the difficulty of taking the parts with you on the carrier that you think are going to break, you know, for the next 6 and 9 months. So that's the problem. And other than personnel salaries and TDY costs, the cost of spare parts is probably the biggest driver of readiness across all the services. So when you're not getting the funding, you're not getting the spare parts, the flying time falls down, and I hope that's a good answer to you.
Well, I was on the dentist, and I was a dentist, so I hear the Marine pilots telling me they had a worse supply line than the Navy side.
They
Do you have
do.
a reason for that?
If I said that the Navy hands off its worst items to the Marine Corps, would anybody disagree with that?
That's the reason.
That's what the Marines compensate for that by having very manliness in every man a rifleman.
Yes.
And they overcome it by willpower. Yeah. Okay, 1914. Attack aviation really began in 1916 with the Battle of the Somme. Lord Trenchard, General Trenchard, put every Camel and every airplane that he could get fly to strafe the German troop lines before the invasion, across the front in the Battle of the Somme. It didn't work. The aircraft did temporary advantages, but the British lost 30,000 men the first hour and 60,000 men the first day in the Battle of the Somme. And they went about 4 or 5 miles, and the Germans counterattacked, and it went back and forth, and it was just a huge bloodbath. But it was the first introduction of aircraft into. Now, you have to give the Germans a lot of credit, and my German pilot friend here will acknowledge this, that the Germans were ahead of us in some things. In the design of aircraft in the early part of the war, developing the Albatross was a great thing. And in 1916, they developed ground attack squadrons. And there's a great book in the library about that. They developed tactics and they trained pilots for it. They had a pilot and a gunner, and the gunner was very important. The same kind of configuration we had all through World War II in attack airplanes. 1917, in June of 1917, de Havilland sent a DH-4 to the United States and let us build the airplane that we would use later. By December, American companies, the automobile companies primarily, built the first DH-4s and sent them back to Europe, and they were the airplanes that the U.S. Air Service and the Naval Service used in World War I. This one was called the Liberty plane because it has the 200 horsepower Liberty engine that was designed in the United States and powered these airplanes. This is the only airplane built in the United States that got into World War I. Our industry was way, way behind the European powers. Well, dive bombing. Frank Wagner was the commanding officer of VF2, and for the other than naval aviators, V means fixed wing, not a helicopter. Helicopter squadrons begin with an H, HS. What's the S for, Daniel?
Sea combat.
What?
Sea combat. Sea
Good.
combat, yeah. Sea
Okay,
control.
good. Yeah, so B is for fixed wing, flying F-6Cs, and you know how F is a fighter, the sixth one, and the C must have been Wright. Wright brothers, I think. Wright brothers. Flying off the USS Langley. Do you know that the USS Langley was based at North Island? 1924. It was based here. We have a picture of it in one of our other briefings. And he was flying off the Langley, which just, again, for somebody who might not know, the Langley was a coal-bearing ship, the first ship to deliver U.S. Servicemen to Europe in 1917. And then we brought it back and converted it into an aircraft carrier. It had wires, actually were just ropes across the wooden deck, held down by sandbags. But the slow airplanes, landing speed, that was enough. And they've had 24 airplanes on that carrier. So anyway, this brilliant guy said, you know, if we're going to deliver bombs, we need to have a dive angle. Now, I've dove at 15 degrees, 25 degrees, 30 degrees was a common read. And the Air Force, the steepest we ever dived was 45 degrees. That was steep enough, but we got very accurate at it. Navy wasn't satisfied with that. After all, they were trying to hit a small, moving target. And so they went to 60 to 70 degrees, and this guy dropped practice, his 25-pound practice bombs from that degree. And the annual fleet problem of 1926, well, that was cool. There we go. He proved it. And the angle was so steep, the sailors on board the ships coming out of San Pedro never saw them. It was a complete surprise. And so they thought, hey, that's a great technique. And so the Navy attack squadrons practiced steep angle dive bombing all the way through World War II. Slide, please. Let's go. There we go. Okay, now we'll... Donald Douglas and Northrop formed Douglas Aircraft right up here, and they designed the Douglas Dauntless. There were Model 2 and Model 3. And notice in 1936, the Navy put out a requirement for, let's go back a little bit. There we go. Okay. Dive flaps. The holes in the dive flaps, nobody knew where they came from. Well, I know they were put there because without the holes there, the airplane was vibrating really bad. The tail was vibrating. The holes are the size of a tennis ball. Who'd have thought it? And they also have a device, a trapeze, to swing the bomb down below the propeller arc. Because with the airplane at a terminal velocity of 240 knots, it's going slower than the bomb will when it falls. Otherwise, it would slide right through the propeller. So in the Battle of Midway, they're carrying 1,000-pound bombs, which they learned very early. If you're going after a hard target, use a really big bomb. And that's the heaviest one that the Dauntless could carry. They had 2,000-pound weapons, but those were called torpedoes. Now, in the Battle of Midway, we had 3 aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown. They had 6 Dauntless squadrons, among them VB, which is fixed-wing bomber, and VS, which is fixed-wing scout. They really weren't any different, but they had different, scout were more of a reconnaissance airplane, but they had the same armament, 112 aircraft, and 3 Devastator squadrons, VT, V, fixed wing, T, torpedo. You know how many Dauntlesses there are remaining in the world? I mean, Devastators?
3.
None. When they made the movie Battle of Midway, Hollywood made a mock-up to use for the Devastator. So the only one we have, I think it's in San Diego Air and Space, is the mock-up Devastator. Now, there were also 42 Devastators, 6 TBDs, the Avenger, and 4 U.S. Army Air Forces B-26s, all carrying torpedoes. You had 54 airplanes carrying torpedoes. Now, as you know, the strategy was that you launch together and you have the torpedo planes go in at the same time the dive bombers are doing steep to, and also then you have fighter cover on top, so you have 3 different sets. Well, it didn't happen that way in the Battle of Midway. The Wildcats took off and ran out of gas before they got to the point of no return. They turned around and came back. There were no Wildcats that I know of that actually engaged in the battle. The torpedo planes took off early, arrived about 9:30, but the dive bombers were not there yet. So they went in all by themselves, and all the Japanese Zeros that were at altitude waiting for the fighters dove down on the torpedo planes and shot the daylights out of them. And those that the fighters didn't get, the gunners on the ship did. I didn't realize, as an Air Force guy, that a torpedo plane needs to slow down to drop the torpedo because the torpedoes couldn't hit the water at greater than a nominal speed, I don't know, 100 or 120 miles an hour. So that made the torpedo guys sitting ducks. Of the 52 torpedo airplanes, a great number were lost, and not a single torpedo caused any damage on one of the 3 Japanese carriers. And so when the dive bombers got there at 10:20, they had everything to go against. They had the fighters to go against, although the fighters were now down on the water, and they weren't at 15,000 feet where the dive bombers were rolling in. And so this part of it, I'm going to tell a story about Ensign Hopkins. I think I need to, well, I'll tell you what he said. I just walked it through. Lou Hopkins was an ensign. He said there were 20 ensigns in the 3 squadrons that he was with on the Enterprise, which was a lot of ensigns right out of flight school. And they got up about 1 o'clock in the morning, went down, nobody could eat breakfast, they were feeling very jittery. They went to the ready rooms, they were waiting for a reconnaissance report that one of the PBYs had found the Japanese fleet. Well, about 7 o'clock in the morning, report came in, they had a designated location, but there was not agreement on where the Japanese fleet was located. So Lou Hopkins was number 11 in takeoff. And I also didn't realize that, with the Navy taking off, one every 30 seconds or every minute, it takes time to get a task force together. You're orbiting around, you're using gasoline. And so they got together, they went up to 22,000 feet to save gas and headed out. They had to drop down because some of the guys' oxygen systems didn't work. Now in the Air Force, if you're over 10,000 feet, you need to be on oxygen. And if you're over 20,000 feet, you need to be in a pressurized cockpit. They didn't have any of those. Now in World War I, the airplanes at the end of the war got up to 24,000 feet without oxygen or pressurization or radios.
Open cut.
Unbelievable. And was it cold in France in the winter? It was about 40 below zero. So they're continuing on. So here, I want you to put yourself in the cockpit. You're flying, the cockpit is closed, but it's still very noisy. You got a guy in the back who's not helping at all because he doesn't see anything. He's trying to gun down. So you're joining on, you're flying in formation, you're all watching the leader. So you look down at your gas gauge and it's reading right about half. So you're thinking, hey, we're getting pretty close to a point of no return. And sure enough, then it starts to fall, now it's less than half. Well, do we have enough fuel to get back to the carrier? we've been flying a long way out. Commander McCluskey, who was the leader of this formation, continued on, and all his little chicks just followed him on out, and they're looking for the Japanese fleet. They fly another 15 minutes, and now the pilots know that most of them probably do not have enough gas to get back. There's one of the first points of heroism. Nobody fell out of that formation. Then suddenly McCluskey sees a destroyer on the surface, hightailing it back as fast as it can go. He says they might be heading back to the fleet, and because they have warning that we're coming. So he follows the destroyer back, and sure enough, clouds open up, and there the whole Japanese fleet, the whole task force is below them. So they drop down to dive bombing altitude, about 12 to 15,000 feet. They roll in. Everybody picks out the different one of the three carriers. Lou Hopkins is number 11 in the dive, and so he sees the guys ahead of him dropping their bombs. Now a few zeros appear, but they're not on him yet. So his backseater, and I'll tell you, this is exactly the same as we did in F4s, another airplane. The guy on the back seat, the most intelligent, the thing he absolutely needs to do is to read off the altitude as you're dive bombing, because you're looking through the gun sight and you are not looking at the altimeter. So the backseater, the gunner is going 5,000 feet, 4,000 feet, 3,000 feet. The target's getting bigger and bigger, and the pilot's looking through a telescope with the crosshairs on it. He's got the crosshairs right on the leading edge of this aircraft carrier, and he gets down to 2,500 feet, and a zero comes in from the right side and almost, disrupts the flight. He drops his bomb real quick, turns into the zero, didn't shoot him down, went down on deck, down to 50 feet, trying to get out of there. And the backseater says, let's get the hell out of here. And Lou Hopkins says, what do you think I'm trying to do? So he's going away, and he knows the approximate location of the Enterprise. So he's down there, and two other ensigns join on his wing. They're 50 feet, they got a little formation of 3, and they're moving back 40 miles out from the carrier. One ensign's engine quits, ran out of fuel. He ditches in the water. Lou notes his position, writes it down on his board, can't do anything else. So they get within sight of the carrier, and another engine of an ensign goes out and he ditches in the water. Both these guys were picked up by destroyers or submarines that were in the task force, so we got a lot of our guys back, even though they had sacrificed their airplane. When Lou Hopkins landed back on the Enterprise, he found out he was one of only 5 airplanes that made it back out of the 34 that took off from the Enterprise. Isn't that incredible? For that, he got the Navy Cross and made Admiral. This is a picture on top in 1942, and on the bottom when he retired as the commander of Point Mugu. So that's the story of Ensign Hopkins. Any questions? Comments? Yes, sir.
I thought on propeller airplanes you could lean out the fuel and get the best economy of it.
Yes, you could. And it wasn't until late 1942 or 1943 that the operational squadrons learned that, because what are you taught in pilot training? Push everything forward. Throttle, prop, and mixture. And they weren't taught to throttle the mixture back, and I don't know what they did at the time, because I don't find that in any of the transcripts. But Charles Lindbergh was the guy that taught the P-38 pilots to lean that thing back and have a high RPM, but you come back a little bit there, and to add range, and it was very, very effective. But they didn't know that in 1942 in June. But, okay, slide. These were the results from the Battle of Midway. We lost the Yorktown. Let's go back. We lost the Yorktown, but the battle with the dive bombers lasted 6 minutes. At 10:20, not a single Japanese carrier had been hit, and at 10:26, 6 minutes later, 3 of the Japanese carriers were on the way to the briny deep, and the 4th carrier was sunk later that afternoon. So look what happened. We lost 150 aircraft because of all those guys ditching in the water. Japanese lost 248. We had 307 killed, I think probably mostly from the fire and the explosions on the Yorktown, which was so badly damaged, and they thought we could tow it back, but then the Japanese submarine put 2 torpedoes into it, and it sunk. The Japanese lost over 3,000 men and all of their air crew. Their planes had no place to go back and land. Amazing. When you lose all the carriers, that's what happens. It precluded the amphibious landing with the 5,000 soldiers that the Japanese had on board, and halted Japanese expansion in World War II. So that's the story of Midway. Any questions? Comments? Okay, now, next story. Okay, there we go. This is the story of the fighter mafia. In 1965, the Secretary of Defense and the Army were trying to get the Air Force to buy a close air support airplane. We were flying, we borrowed A-1s from the Navy, and that's what I flew in Vietnam, the E model with 2 seats, because we had to fly with the Vietnamese for the first couple of months. So you needed a 2-seater. So the Macron administration believed in computer studies to develop an aircraft, to decide what aircraft to buy. So there were 2 computer studies, and out of those, a major Air Force decision was made by the Navy A-7, put a gun in the F-4 to make the F-4E model, and to develop the F-15. Because if you're going to have attack airplanes, then you need a real air superiority airplane to protect them. So the F-15 was the Air Force's #1 priority, and everybody, especially the officials, knew it. The problem was the cost was getting exorbitant. Congress was all over DOD's back about the high cost of airplanes and the unreliability of them. High cost, twin engines had to be Mach 2.5, and it weighed 60,000 pounds. And the program office even developed the motto of not a pound for air to ground. You can see the devotion there to the air-to-air mission to the exclusion of the ground attack mission. Slide. And, well, okay. John Boyd was the originator of the fighter mafia. And I've got a quote because some people don't know what the fighter mafia was. But here's what it was. The fighter mafia, this is a quote from a famous book called National Defense that James Fallon wrote. James Fallon was the editor of Atlantic Monthly and had a lot of influence on the East Coast and with decision makers. And you can imagine, this was halfway through the Vietnam War, there was a lot of disgust about what government was doing. There was a feeling the government couldn't really do anything right. And we had riots in the streets and all that stuff. This is a quote, the American national defense strategy was flawed because military leadership was incompetent, the weapons acquisition process was corrupt, high defense budgets were linked to high inflation, and what America needed was a new strategy that embraced a much greater number of simple, reliable, and less expensive weapon systems, especially tactical airplanes. The F-111 was extremely expensive, the F-14 was fairly expensive, and the F-15 was going to be very expensive. And the problem with big budgets, within a limited budget, if you're paying half or over half of your budget to buy one particular airplane, what do you have left over to buy the others to keep the size of the fleet high? In fact, I've often thought that the Navy's commitment to fighter aircraft first and attack airplanes second was the attack airplanes were paid with the money that was left over after the fighters were developed. And if any of you have had problems with attack airplanes, you might agree with that. Well, John Boyd and my classmate, Mike Lowe, Mike was a major in fighter requirements in the Air Staff, and they got together and they had a boss named Colonel Riccioni, and he developed the idea of the fighter mafia. So the fighter mafia was trying to develop a lightweight, simple airplane to be better than the F-15, but they couldn't tell anybody about it because if the higher officials heard, they would kill it because they didn't want anything to threaten the F-15. The F-15 was a top priority in the Air Force. So nothing would have happened if that's all they wanted. I mean, guys have been frustrated in the military forever. That's no big deal. But their boss, Riccioni, found $149,000 that he could put in a budget. He let the budget to General Dynamics and Northrop and invited their top aircraft designer engineers to Washington at night and on weekends in a secret meeting in a Pentagon motel to design an alternative to the F-15. And they all had an idea to build a 20,000-pound airplane with one engine instead of two, to do Mach 1.4 instead of 2.5, and not have the swing wing concept of the F-111 and the original F-15, lightweight, low cost, air-to-air radar only, so what happened? A couple of things, and these are the three guys that ended up doing. Harry Hillacre, John Paterno, and Kelly Johnson from the three biggest aerospace companies. So what happened? How did they succeed? Well, they succeeded in designing a YF-16, the Y being a developmental test airplane, and Northrop developed the YF-17. The biggest innovation was a fly-by-wire system. As you all know, fighters were controlled from the stick to the control surfaces by hydraulic lines. In the F-100, we had tons of hydraulic lines and 3,000 PSI in those lines. Does hydraulic fluid ever leak on an aircraft carrier? Does it ever not leak?
Yeah.
And it leaked on Air Force bases too. So by changing to fly-by-wire, you lose all that weight that goes into the airplane, and they found out that now you don't have to artificially put weight in the nose to get the center of gravity forward. So they could put the center of gravity any place they wanted it, and they maintained stability. The F-16 is dynamically unstable. It's maintained stability only by the electronic inputs that the pilot makes. So that gives, first of all, you can increase the G-forces from 7.3, which all aircraft had at that time, to 9. They put the seat back, leaning back 30 degrees, so the pilot is better to take the G-forces, and the F-16 was so maneuverable that the G-suit that we all wore for years was inadequate because it didn't open fast enough to overcome the G's that the F-16 could create. So they had to develop a new system that would provide pressure to the bottom part of the pilot to avoid him blacking out in just normal aerospace maneuvers. So many innovations occurred here when they had that, the idea that they could do a better job. The F-17 had many of the same things, but they had the idea to put twin engines. Of course, Northrop, with the T-38 and the F-5, loved their two little engines. And so they put them in the Cobra and ended up, and why? Well, one reason was the Navy loved twin engines. So after competition, let me go back a little bit. So the first innovation was this $149,000 contract. You got all these wonderful ideas from industry, but now how are you gonna build a real airplane? Well, 1968, the administration changed. Republicans came in. The Secretary of Defense was Melvin Laird. The Deputy Secretary of Defense was David Packard, and David Packard loved prototyping. And he set aside $200 million to to build prototypes and actually fly the aircraft in competition with one another. So now this little $149,000 contract grew to a $200 million contract, and the promise at the end of it was probably a $3 billion contract.
Wow.
And the aerospace companies knew that, so they really put their best ideas here. They had a fly-off between the F-16 and the F-17. It was very close. Both of them were very maneuverable. The F-16 was a little cheaper and had a little more maneuverability, so it won the Air Force competition. Now, okay, what is the Navy going to do? The Navy was ordered to evaluate the F-16 for use on a carrier. Can you imagine how that evaluation went? Well, it started with, we don't want to buy no goddamn Air Force airplane. And secondly, how many engines does it have? One. Wrong. And third, that landing gear is never going to hold up on a single carrier landing. And so we want a twin engine airplane, and we want a Navy company to build it. Well, Northrop was an Air Force company, because they were buying the D-38. So the Navy made Northrop team with McDonnell Douglas, which quickly swallowed up Northrop. And they had the F-17 developed into the F-A-18. It started out to be two airplanes, the F-18A for air-to-air and the F-15B for attack, because of the tradition of fighter and attack in the Navy. But with the 2-year lapse time from the F-16 and the fly-by-wire that saved a lot of weight in the airplane, the designer said, hey, this airplane can do both. In fact, talking to Air Force and Navy pilots, they prefer the F-A-18 for air-to-air, and they prefer the F-16 for air-to-ground. I skipped over the story about how the F-16 became air-to-ground, but I'll tell you later if anyone's really interested. That's also a good story. Okay, next slide. So what happened? Well, David Jones, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, negotiated with the Secretary of Defense, Schlesinger, that if the DoD would let the Air Force buy the F-15, they would buy a greater number of F-16s, which only cost 2/3 as much, and they could have 3 more tactical fighter wings. And you know how generals and admirals love the numbers of more and more fighters. And so that idea was persuasive to the Secretary of Defense. And at the same time, 4 NATO countries said, hey, we need an airplane, a multi-purpose airplane, to replace our 104Gs that are sitting ground alert on nuclear alert, and we want a multi-mission airplane to do the same thing. The F-16 looks like, and cheap, by the way. And so it began with 4 NATO countries buying it. The airplane was operational only 7 years after the prototype fly-off, and it is still the backbone of the Air Force. There are 4,600 F-16s built. It's now flown by 31 different countries, and it's kept the price low doing that entire thing. And it's going to remain in the Air Force fighter force beyond 2030. That's how important it is. And so, now how do we get to the F-18? Well, remember the Northrop designers were present in that motel when all these ideas were going around about how to design a better airplane. They were influenced by the fighter mafia, and they had them taped, and so the F-18 becomes a multi-mission fighter. We now have 2 versions. The C and D models they were first operational in 2001. They lasted until 2019 when the last was retired. They just wore them out. And so now Boeing, who bought General Dynamics, who bought McDonnell Douglas, developed the E and F-18. The E is a single seat, and the F is the twin seat airplane. And so, they're 25% larger than the F-18. The original F-18 was not liked by the Navy, especially the attack pilots, because it had so little gas. Remember, they were flying the F-4 and the A-7 and the A-6, which had tremendous amounts of gas. And the F-18 just didn't have that in their small fuselage. But the ENF version does. It's 25% larger. Of course, the price is up. The Navy has already bought 608. And as the F-35 is slow to come on board, and because of all the software problems they're having, the Navy's buying more F-18s to keep the force full. And one big advantage, of course, is now carriers can deploy with just one airplane, one set of logistics stocks, and you don't have this division between air-to-air and air-to-ground. Okay, let's see. Well, let's go here. Yeah, see if you can punch it. Next one's an F-35 slot, and I'll just run over that quickly. Just move it on. Anyway, the F-35 is another attempt to build one airplane for all the services. It does have that's good. It does have a tremendous capability, but it is extremely expensive. Over $100 million a copy. The F-15 was about $30 million, and the F-16 was about 15 or 12 million. Now we're looking at $100 million airplanes. So the F-35A is going to be Air Force. The F-35B will be Marine Corps, and F-35C is the Navy. Yes, sir.
The F-22 cost how much?
Pardon?
How much did the F-22 cost?
200 million.
200 million, probably 200 million with very short production line. It'll be out of the force.
F-35 is a cheaper airplane.
Every generation is getting, more and more expensive. Yes, sweetie?
And who did Tom Cruise?
Oh, yes.
fly?
Tom Cruise.
Maverick.
And if you saw Top Gun Maverick, Tom Cruise was flying the FA-18
Show it.
Well,
with a lot of help.
that's right. The backseat.
He does have his own P-51. He's a dedicated pilot. He's got a really good-looking P-51. Well, there's only one more slide after that, but here's the paradox. The Navy in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s was flying specialized airplanes, air-to-air airplanes, fighters, and air-to-ground airplane attack. And so now, with the F-18, they're all flying multi-purpose. And with the F-35, there'll be more multi-purpose. The Air Force began and continued like multi-purpose airplanes. What broke the back of attack in World War II was the twin missions of the P-51 and the P-47. We found out after we won the air war over Germany that the P-47 was a wonderful ground attack airplane. And they destroyed more German airplanes on the ground, I think, than they did in the air. P-47 had 8 50 caliber machine guns, a huge air-cooled engine, like Navy engines, and they lost a lot of airplanes in air to ground, and that's been the story forever, ever since World War I. If you get down, under 1,000 feet, almost anything can knock you down, a rock thrown up there. A 50 caliber machine gun's active range is about 4,500 feet. And so that was kind of a floor for many of the operations that we did. So, but one of the things that you can take away from this is that over this period, in both the Air Force and the Navy, they developed airplanes with the biggest engines they could find, which were often a limiting factor. And the designs changed as the needs of the service changed. And the brilliant thing was that the Navy was developing the Dauntless dive bomber in the early 1930s, 10 years before it turned out they really needed it in the Battle of Midway. And so it's that kind of foresight to develop those things now that you're going to need in the future that is the real challenge in the aerospace business. Well, I want to thank you. You've been an absolutely wonderful audience. You're all my age. We did bring along a few books. I'll be glad to endorse any of them to you. I want to thank Jacqueline for offering us these wonderful facilities. and to each of you for your now aviation career. Thanks very much.